Dwayne Joseph. I'm the extension agent up in Kent County. Do we have any Kent County residents here today? Hey, there we go. Nice to meet you guys. So I'm just gonna go briefly, kind of speak about some of the work we're doing in fruits, mainly cucurbit fruits. So that's why the vegetables in there, because some people call cucurbits vegetables. Well, minus cucumbers, but mainly in watermelons and cantaloupe. So we at University of Maryland, we're required to have these slide on here, and basically what it says is, since we get funding from USDA, if anybody is discriminated upon, there's means to you get in touch with USDA and they'll be able to handle whatever cases. But we at the University of Maryland, we don't discriminate based on various reasons. So just to go briefly through some weed management, mainly because I like weeds. I don't know if you guys like weeds, but I like weeds. And then like I said earlier, I'll mention what we're working with. Cantaloupe study. We also have a watermelon study. The watermelon study is basically more spearheaded by one of my colleagues, Dr. Vollmer. And after that, we'll just conclude, and if I have time for any questions, you guys are free to ask any questions. And I just want to say also, if you have any questions, you could also stop me and, just ask me those questions, and I'll try to answer. So the question is, why do we control weeds, right? Anybody here loves weeds? Anybody except me? You like weeds? Okay. So the question is, why do we control weeds, right? So that might be a silly question to ask, but weeds actually compete with our crop for light, for nutrients, for whatever resources we have, right? We know that it reduces yield. Also, it's a vector for viruses. So a lot of people don't really understand that or really know that weeds can be vectors for viruses. When it comes to pesticide application, herbicide applications, they kind of impede that. If you have weeds growing, depending on how tall they are, they can kind of intercept whatever herbicide or whatever pesticide that you're trying to apply. Also aesthetics, if you guys have any U-pick operations, you want it to look pretty. When you have people out there, when you have your neighbors visiting and stuff, walking around, you want to keep those weeds under control, because you want, basically your place to look pretty. And also it harbors pests and diseases. So what I want to kind of focus on right now is that part of, weeds, why we need to control weeds when it comes to pests and diseases. So weeds can host pests, right? So if we look at aphids, they really like to be on milkweeds, on saw thistles, prickly lettuce. Am I coming through good?
Yeah, you're fine. This mic's...
Doesn't work? Okay.
It's having a problem. That mic's working.
Okay, placebo effect. I actually thought it was working. Prickly lettuce, mustards, aphids just love them. Like whatever weeds that tend to have like a milky sap, aphids are really attracted to those. If we look at brown marmorated sting bugs, again, they like the milkweeds, they like mustards, they like grasses. Recently, well, not recently, but in the past 5-6 years, spotted lanternflies become a big issue. Up in Kent County, it's an issue. I know in more of the northern counties, it's a really bad issue. And their host plant is tree of heaven. Tree of heaven is an invasive weed. They like to host on that plant. And if you have any vineyards or any orchards, they would, basically move into those. So spotted lanternfly is a very big issue. Also, if we look at stink bugs, they love lamb's quarters, Russian thistles, and just normal field mice and rodents, right? Weeds provide harbor for them. In one of our plots down in Upper Marlboro, we had, what's the name? The woodchucks. I forgot the other name for it, but groundhog, there you go. Groundhogs just, tearing up our cantaloupe fields because they were hiding in some of those weeds that weren't on the edge of the fields. So, when it comes to host of pests, we need to be able to control weeds if we want to control those pests. So if we move and we look at damage, so damage from weed competition is related to a number of things, right? When we look at the weed composition, the types of weeds that we have in our fields, that we have in our orchards, also the density of those weeds, right? The more weeds you have in there, the greater the impact on it. If we also look at the growth stage of our crop or our trees, prior to establishment and in the developmental stage, that will be when weeds will be the most impactful, right? When we look at the non-bearing and the bearing stage, we also need to be able to, it's very important to control or manage weeds in these two stages. But in those two stages, herbicides are not, as important versus the other two stages that I mentioned earlier. But also weed management needs to be actually thought about in the bearing and the non-bearing stage of those trees. Also, when we look at harvesting fruit, weeds interfere with that. Again, aesthetics, if you have a U-pick, you don't want your field to look, too ugly, basically. So when it comes to perennial weeds, it's really an issue in fruit crops, right? Not much as annuals. Annuals are a little easier to take care of compared to perennials, right? Before you set out your field, it's very crucial to completely eradicate like all perennials that you have in there, right? Make sure all those perennials are gone. And that's because once you plant, you're basically limiting your management practices, right? Especially when it comes to herbicides. Herbicide injury, you don't want any of that. So when you have perennials in your field, it's all very important to completely eradicate them before starting off. Perennial weeds, like we see, are very aggressive. They easily outcompete with small transplants. You put those transplants out there, they'd outcompete with them. I'm thinking of a grower. I have a grower up in Kent County. He's growing organic Christmas trees. And he had a big issue with nutsedge in there. And whenever he put those seedlings in, later in the season, that nutsedge would grow up and just outcompete those seedlings. So you need to be able to be mindful about that. Also, when it comes to control of perennials, they're very hard to control, notoriously hard to control, actually, and very invasive. And that's mainly because of the root system that they put out, right? They generally require multiple herbicide applications to manage. Again, you have to be able to make a plan, and I'll get into that a little earlier, especially when you have perennials out there. You need to be able to make a reasonable plan where you understand that it wouldn't just take one pass, basically, or one application to control those perennials in there. And managing those perennials before, like I said, before establishment really pays off, right? It costs, to replant your whatever fruit trees or saplings you have in there. When it comes to excessive weed control, that costs money too. Also, it kind of lowers your quality and your yield. And also the risk of herbicide damage is also there. So again, managing perennial weeds is very important. So trees are slower growers than weeds, right? So weeds grow really quickly at first. Trees take a long time for them to establish. So when you have actively growing young trees, weeds have a big impact on them. The weed competition can lead to establishment failure. Like I said earlier, you have to go out there and replant. Weeds would be able to, in the first couple months, couple weeks, would be able to get taller than your seedlings really quickly. Even a little weed infestation is very detrimental, and that could, in the long term, delay your growth and your production for years to come. Also, when it comes to limited use of herbicides, when your trees are very small, you have that very small window to apply herbicides, and you don't have that many that are registered in fruit trees. So, you risk herbicide damage. Susceptible damage from pests and other diseases are also another problem that you could get when you have those young trees newly or freshly planted. So if we move to the non-bearing stage, you need to set goals to eliminate weed competition, right? So you've gone through the young, actively growing stage, you reach the non-bearing stage, you still need to take measures when it comes to weed management. In that stage, heavy weed infestations can still delay maturity and productivity. You also want to consider the tree age when it comes to whatever herbicides you're selecting, because there are different herbicides that are labeled for non-bearing trees versus bearing trees. And again, trees are still susceptible to herbicide damage even when they're in the non-bearing stage. When you get to the bearing stage, you know, it's a little easier to get control and management of weeds in that stage. Generally at that time, the plant is more tolerant to herbicides and other weed management tactics. But again, heavy infestations of weeds are still detrimental and can still drastically affect your harvest. And again, the weeds are vectors for diseases. Even in the bearing stage, you need to be careful about that. So all what I just gave you there, if we follow these guidelines, everything should be right, okay? So I have this little animation, not really. When I made it, it seemed good to me when I made that little animation. I was like, oh, I'm gonna put it out there, these guys are gonna laugh, but okay. So, you know, all what I just mentioned, we still need to think about integrated weed management, right? I know it's been a big buzz. IPM, integrated pest management, is the same. We're kind of going to delve into integrated weed management. And what that basically is a combination of as many practices as possible that you can use that will injure your weed, right? If we look at mechanical practices, mowing, chemical, herbicides, biologicals, using different pests and different animals to control those weeds, and also cultural practices like cover cropping. Where all of these intersect is what we call integrated weed management. And the reason why integrated weed management is very big right now is because we're trying to reduce herbicide resistance, right? There's a big issue with herbicide resistance. I'll hit a little bit about it in a couple more slides. But with an integrated management plan, we're able to, you know, combat or kind of slow down the selection for herbicide resistance. So when it comes to having an IWM or integrated weed management plan, it should be specific to the weed being targeted, right? You can't just go out there and just use any plan on any weed. So it needs to be targeted for the weed that you're going to look at. Also, these practices are more effective on younger weeds for obvious reasons. They're actively growing. They haven't set as many growing points yet. They're more effective on annual weeds than perennials because annuals come up every year, whereas perennials, they're there for a little longer. Sometimes in the off season, in the winter, they're under the ground. We can't really see them. Chemical methods, again, are not very effective on stress plants, right? So if you're out there using your herbicides, if it's droughty, if it's hot that day, if it's above 90 degrees, plants kind of shut down. They close their stomata, they stop respiring. So whatever herbicide you apply on them, they won't be able to take it up as efficiently as you would like. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to having an integrated weed management plan. So keeping with the plan, you need to state specific and reasonable goals, right? I was speaking a couple weeks ago at a horticultural meeting, and we were talking about bamboo management. You know, running bamboo, basically they reproduce vegetatively through stolons, through rhizomes. So cutting it off or applying a herbicide on it will not kill it the first time. So you need to understand that, you know, this will take multiple applications. This will take multiple passes of whatever I'm going to do. It's going to take a lot of seasons, many seasons. So again, state a reasonable plan. Walk your fields, go out there, scout, see what weeds are in your fields. When I was in grad school, my advisor always had me to walk out there for book, weed diary, we call it. So you put in all your weeds in there. Now we have phones. Well, we had phones back then. I'm not that old. We had phones back then also, but you could go out there, take pictures of what weeds you see, take a note, and then you design a plan that will integrate effective management practices. So you don't just use herbicides. You want to use, if can this cover crops work, can tillage work, can mowing work. You want to incorporate all of these when you think of implementing your plan. And the reason to have a plan is that it will reduce input costs, right? When you have a plan, you know how exactly you're going to tackle this problem. That would help you reduce the amount of inputs that you're going to put and whatever you're going to throw at this problem that you have. So recently, it's been really easy to be able to identify weeds, right? When I was in grad school, well, I had to do it. We had to go out there with our key book, look at those weeds, try to key it out. Right now, it's really easy when it comes to IDing plants, IDing weeds. And the reason to have a proper ID of those plants in our field is so that we could be able to use the effective measures against them, right? What if we have a grass versus a broadleaf, if we have an annual versus a perennial, how they disperse their seeds, their method of reproduction, what time they germinate, what time you would see that weed flush. All of that is important to know. When it comes to IDing those weeds that you have out there, if you're not really familiar with the weeds in your area, you could always get a book. There's a Northeast Guide to Weeds. That's what I could think of the top of my head. It would have all the weeds, all the plants in the Mid-Atlantic area. Or if you want to go the easy route, you could also get, download one of these apps. Basically, simple point and click app. You go out there, you see your leaf, you take a picture of your leaf, and basically it would give you what it thinks the weed you're showing it is, right? In my experience, picture this is the most effective, and it's not only me. There's been some research out there, and it shows that this app is about 85% accurate when it comes to broadleaves. When it goes to grasses, no apps are really accurate, but this one would point you in the direction of what you see in 85% of the time. Also, this could use as a supplement. It could kind of give you what family of weed you're looking at, and then you could go in a book and kind of figure out what exactly. So I always recommend using one of those ID apps. So two words that kind of go kind of synonymous with each other, but in my opinion are not the same, is weed control and weed management, right? If we see our little cartoon clip art here, weed control is basically a reactive, a reaction, right? You see a weed, you go out there, you immediately kill it. You don't know what it is. You don't know if it reproduces through stolons. You don't know if it reproduces through seed. You see it, you kill it. Couple weeks after, you come back, there are more in there. So we want to stay away from weed control, and we want to move into weed management. And what weed management is basically a proactive approach, right? You go, you see, you figure out a plan, and you implement your plan to control those weeds. So we're trying to stay away from weed control and go into weed management. So this flow chart here kind of goes through some decision making when it comes to integrated weed management implementation. You monitor whatever weeds you're out there, you locate the area, you apply your treatment, and you monitor your treatment, right? And you ask yourself, was it effective? Yes or no? If it wasn't effective, you go back, you adjust your plan, and you apply it again. If it was effective, you ask yourself, do I need to follow up? Do I need to do additional treatments? If yes, you apply those follow-up treatments, you monitor again, you look, you see, was it effective? If it wasn't effective, you go back, you run that whole loop again, and you adjust your plan. So, that's kind of like what you want to think about when it comes to having that plan and going out there and implementing your plan when you see different weed problems or different infestations in your fields. So like I said earlier, the main reason for all of this integrated weed management, pest management, is to get rid of herbicide resistance or slow down herbicide resistance. And what herbicide resistance is basically a plant's acquired ability to survive what was once a lethal dose of a herbicide, right? So let's say you go out there, you used to spray this on a pig, a palmer, a pigweed, and then in a couple seasons down the line, like it's not working. The palmer is still coming up. So I have a little illustration that kind of goes through this, right? So what we see here is we have a field. We go out, we have some weeds in there. The green weeds are basically susceptible, but the red ones are, they have a mutation. They just naturally have a mutation. That just naturally happens in any organism, plant, animal. And that kind of prevents them from being susceptible to whatever herbicide. So we go out, we spray, we kill all the susceptible. Now we have just resistant. We didn't control those resistance. They go, they grow, they go to seed, they reproduce. Next season we come out again. Now we could see we have a little bit more resistance, a little bit more resistant plants. We spray again, we kill all the susceptible. And what would happen in about 3, 4, 5 seasons down the line, this field will be completely overrun by resistant plants or resistant weeds. So just a quick snapshot of herbicide resistance. So currently there are 509 reported cases of resistant weeds globally, and 164 different herbicides that have resistant weed biotypes. So that's a lot. When I first started grad school, that number was way lower. Every year, it keeps growing and growing and growing. So that's why, again, when it comes to management, we want to have an integrated plan and not just rely on herbicides. Also, another thing that that's very when it comes to good management practices is prevention. So you want to keep your surrounding weed areas weed-free, right? Your canals, your ditches, your roadsides, your surrounding fields. Don't just concentrate on your orchard or concentrate on your field where you're planting, right? Because what happens is weeds, depends on the dispersal method, they can always fly in. So you always want to control in surrounding areas. You want to keep your equipment clean. If you're mowing a tractor, if you're using a four-wheeler, you always want to keep those clean. When it comes to cover crops, I use a lot of those. Always get certified seed, and that would kind of cut down on basically getting dirty seed with any weeds and stuff in there. So it costs a little bit more, but it would help in the long run. And also you want to check your clothes, your boots for weed seed, right? When I was in, and I keep saying that, but when I was in grad school, we had a professor, and he was very, very adamant to whoever walked into his fields, because he had some weed research going on, and he's like, always check your feet, always check your boots, because you never know what you could be bringing into your field. So just changing gears a little bit, I'm going to start going over some of the research which we've done. Again, this is a cantaloupe study, not really a tree fruit, but still a fruit in my house. So what we're using is a living mulch, right? And most of you are supposed to be familiar with living mulches. It's basically a cover crop that's grown at the same time with your cash crop. They grow together during the season. And the reason why we use living mulches is because they suppress weed growth, because they act as a green cover, hence the name living mulch. They prevent erosion, they improve your soil structure. Also, when we have a lot of fruits and vegetables, they're really good at increasing beneficial insects, pollinators, and increasing biodiversity. So our living mulch of choice is red clover. It's very fast growing. It has a lot of beneficial characteristics. It's pollinator friendly. It has those pretty pink flowers that attract bees, butterflies, all different types of pollinators. which we need when it comes to pollinating our fruits. Also, it's a nitrogen fixer. It's a legume. It fixes nitrogen. You don't have to put down as much nitrogen. It's not light competitive. It doesn't get really tall. It gets taller than the white clovers, the shorter clovers, but it doesn't get really tall, especially if we have any erect fruit growing in there. It wouldn't compete with any light. Again, it improves soil structure with that nice root system. And also because it's understudied, right? A lot of people, studies have been done in different types of clovers, not really in red clover. So we're trying to see if we could use red clover as a living mulch in vegetable and also fruit systems.
What's
So
what's the establishment window for red clover?
what's the what, sorry?
Establishment window with the spring?
So we plant our red clover in the fall.
Fall.
You won't see it doing anything like any cover crop but probably about when it warms up late March, then it'll start going a little crazy. But yeah, we start them all off in the fall, sorry. And they need to be started off in the fall, early in the fall, to be able to survive over winter if we have a harsh winter, which I heard we haven't had in a long time over here. So the objectives of our study was to develop a working system that uses a living mulch, a strip tillage, and also what we call soft herbicides, right? And soft herbicides is basically organic herbicides. And we want to manage weeds, suppress insect pests. This talk, I'm just going to focus on the weed aspect. We also had an insect aspect, which I leave for our entomologists. I'm not an entomologist. So that's just a basic cartoon of what our treatments, our field look like. We had basically two fields which we split. One was looking at a basic standard farmer practice. Again, our crop here is cantaloupe. What we did was we had a high input and a low input. High input it's not a high, the reason why we call it high and low is just for comparison's sake, but high input is basically what would be conventionally used, a pre and some post herbicide applications. In the low input, what we did was we used, instead of putting that post, we used home plate, which is a Omri, an organic herbicide. We used that together with the stale seedbed technique. And if you're not familiar with that technique, is basically you disturb the soil, you get a nice weed flush, you kill whatever is in there with herbicides, and then you plant right after that. Our bare ground type was with plastic culture. We had plastic when we looked at our living mulch treatment or our red clover treatment. We did the same, but we strip tilled where we were going to plant. So we stripped and then we transplanted in those strips, and we left the clover in between. And with the low input, the high input, it was the same herbicides. We just banded them within that band, that strip band. So that's just kind of looking at what the field looked like. Over here is basically our monoculture or our plastic culture, and here we have our living mulch. So when it comes to ground cover, what we found was that obviously, in the plastic study, we didn't have any living mulches. So we saw more weeds and more bare soil. Where we applied our herbicide or our high input, which denotes with that little herbicide guy, we saw more bare soil versus weeds. When we didn't have any high inputs, we saw basically almost an equal amount of bare soil and weeds. Cover crop, when we applied versus when we didn't apply a high input, we basically had more cover crop versus any weeds and any bare soil. When we look at weed abundance in weed type, Broadleaf weeds here are denoted by the black bars. The white bars look at our grasses. What I want to kind of make note of here is you could see that big difference between the weeds in the plastic culture or the monoculture plots versus the red clover plots or the living mulch plots. Big difference. What we had an issue was with our fruit yield, right? And again, we're researchers, so we can get away with that. You guys can't get away with that. That's why we do research. That's why we could tweak stuff, right? So we didn't get as much yield. We still got better yield in the monoculture, and we kind of figured out why. So this season, we're going to tweak it a little bit to make sure that we figure out and try to get the yield on par with the plastic culture. So like I said, to improve on next year's, we're going to get wider strips, right? So last year we had 24-inch strips where we planted into. This year we're going to go for 40-inch strips, and that's because we saw a lot of competition, because the way red clover grows, it kind of came into the row, and because it was it's a cucurbit, it's viney, it kind of covered the leaves basically of the cantaloupe. Also, we want to strip till a little deeper. The reason why is because we strip till shallow. The root system of the clover wasn't disrupted enough, and what happened is we got clover coming up in our row that we strip till. And also we want to mow closer to the planting date. So by mowing, we kind of push it back a little and get our crop to be able to establish better. So moving on to our watermelon study, and this watermelon study was looking at using spring-seeded cover crops in between our plastic beds. Just quickly, benefits of growing on plastic mulch. We all know, it allows earlier production, it improves soil quality, it reduces soil erosion. But what the problem is that between those beds, we have bare soil, right? And when you have bare soil, what happens? Weeds show up. So in our study, we look at using spring oats and also cereal rye. The reason we use those two is because they give a flexibility. They can be seeded in the spring after you set those beds. When it comes to spring oat, it produces a lot of biomass. Rye, not as much because it's planted in the spring and not the fall. In the fall, you'd get way more biomass. But rye's mode of action when it comes to weed suppression is allelopathy, right? So even when they're planted in the spring, they don't get as much biomass, but they have that allelopathic effect on weeds. So that's why we chose those two. So the objectives of this study was to evaluate the effects of our different cover crop tactics on weed suppression. Also, we wanted to evaluate cover crops for reducing herbicide applications. So, with a bare ground, you'd have to apply a lot of herbicides. So what we're trying to do is trying to reduce that herbicide application. So we did have herbicides in this group, in this study, but we are trying to reduce the amount of herbicides that we applied. Our design for our study was basically, it was a factorial design. So that means we had different factors we were looking at, right? So one of our factors was cover crop termination. And what we did is we had 3 levels of that. So we terminated with paraquat or gramoxone. We also terminated some fields with clethodim. And also we terminated the cover crop without any herbicide. We just roller crimped. When it comes to cover crop type, we had 2 cover crops we were looking at. Like I said, spring oats by itself. We're looking at cereal rye by itself. We looked at the 2 in a mix, in a 50-50 mix. And also for control, we had no cover crop in between some of our plots. In previous research, we found that that spring oats gave us good early season weed control, but it didn't last for the full season. So we're looking at adding a residual and seeing if that residual would basically give us full season weed control. And the residual we used was a mix of dual magnum and reflex.
Hey, Dwayne,
Yep.
that oats and rye, that's a lot of seed.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of seed.
It's spring.
It's a lot of seed.
Yeah, spring. So we adjusted it for the spring, and we were looking at some research was showing. We did. Kurt Vollmer, who was the PI on this, he did some research out here with that rate, and that's what gave him the best control. Yeah.
How much nitrogen do you have that?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much nitrogen. Chris, do you know how much nitrogen Kurt put down?
Yep, so when we grew Kirk's watermelons, we put down, we put it into the nutrient management program. I want to tell you this year, it was only like 25 pounds
Yeah.
of nitrogen, and then we feed everything else through the drip.
I think nitrogen for the cover crop.
Oh, so that 25 pounds is broadcasted down after we rototill, and then we shape the bed. So whatever they get in between the rows after that application is what's there for them.
Was that enough?
I mean, the oats did the best, I thought.
Yeah,
I mean, they get almost knee high out there, you know, so. And I think it does seem like a lot of seed to the acre, but I think when Kirk does the math, he's not thinking of like a square acre. He's thinking of that measurement
Small
between
plots,
the plastic.
Hmm.
So really that seems like a lot, but, and I mean, we sprinkle it out by hand. You could do it with like a broadcast spreader on a 3-point hitch tractor and then take a leaf blower and blow it off to get, you know, your cover in there, but the oats, I was pretty happy with the oats.
Yeah, the oats did pretty good, and I'll show it. The oats did pretty good. I also did the study in peppers over in Upper Marlboro. We didn't do as good with the rye the first year, and that's because we got a rust. But the rye did okay, seeing it was spring planted basically.
Okay, it's all over. Did you ban it for blood?
We got a drop spreader.
So you banned it?
Well,
So we seeded the cover crop in April, both years, 21, 22, late April. I went in, transplanted the watermelons in June. And then we terminated the cover crop, followed by adding the residual on mid-June, basically, both years. So looking at the biomass, like I was mentioning earlier, oats, again, sorry for not changing this. It was presented at an international thing, so we had to change it to metric, and I was too lazy to change it back. But what we see here basically is oats had the highest biomass at termination, right? And that's kind of expected. Rye was a little lower, and again, rye was spring planted, kind of contributes to that, and the mix was in between. When we look at weed density, and that's 4 weeks after we transplanted, and again, that's at termination. Obviously, the no cover had the highest amount of weeds. When it comes to the lowest amount of weeds, we have oats had the lowest amount of weeds, but it wasn't significantly different from rye. This one is a little bit more complicated. The different colors, so we're looking at a cross of our two factors. So the different colors kind of denote the termination factor, clefidin paraquat rolled in black. And then at our x-axis, we have our different treatments. Basically, what we can take from this is, why is it advancing on its own? Any treatment that was terminated with clefidin, we got the best with paraquat. Sorry, we got the best late season weed control versus when we rolled it.
Why do you think that is?
Because because paraquat was able to. So what we think is because paraquat, when we terminated, it was able to get the weeds that was in there. So clefidin is a grass, so it would be able to. We were able to control those grasses, but it didn't control the broadleaves in there.
You have broadleaves in your cover crop between the plastic.
Yep.
Well, that's not supposed to be.
Well, yeah, it's not supposed to, but it happens. We have some aggressive weeds out here. But most of the weeds we had were on the on the shoulder, which is hard to control. So yeah, on that shoulder.
I had 3 inches between the plastic and the...
Exactly. That's that. Once, if anybody has any any anecdotes for that, please let us know. What I'm going to try to do next year is what we found was that if we use a red clover mix with a grass, because the clover vines a little bit, it kind of comes over the plastic and kind of blocks that shoulder. So that's something we're going to try again. We're going to try this year. But so when we look at yield, we didn't see much differences with the rye and oats, but you know the take home here is that basically with a cover crop we had better control versus without a cover crop. Again, paraquat gave us the best yielding fruits again because paraquat was able to control what I believe is both types of weeds at termination. So just to put a bow on this, so when we look at cover crops, the presence was able to increase yield and weed control compared to when there's no cover crop. Termination with paraquat offered the best weed control, and applying a residual herbicide improved our weed control or weed management.
What do you think the liability is for this for early melons? Because I see where you transplanted in June. How about May 1st?
So the reason we did June was because of our past research. We wanted to time the peak biomass with right before the vines came off the plastic. So by pushing it a little earlier, we might not get as much biomass, which is the driving factor for the suppression of the weeds. This year, I think this year, and again, I don't have the data for this, but this year, Kurt Vollmer, he looked at he looked at termination dates, right? He looked at boot stage versus, I forgot the other stage. But he was looking at that specifically, and he has more data on that. Sorry, I didn't present it.
And also on the red clover, do you think that potentially the heavy flower of the red clover might have competed with pollination, and that might have been an issue with the yield? I mean, with only so many pollinators out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. I was just looking at the weeds aspect. I'm sorry, but we also have an entomologist on that, so I'll mention that to him. That makes a lot of sense. So with that, just acknowledgement, Sir Rudy Hooks, a lot of this research was from his lab. Kurt Vollmer, like I said, was the watermelon study PI. Leo Kerner, he's the grad student who works with us, and Alan Leslie. Shameless plug, if I have enough time, we have a transition to organic production. If any of you are curious about transitioning to organic, we have a free program, a free meeting. We have speakers from New York State, and come out there, free lunch, free food, March the 19th, Chesapeake College. If you need more information, just let me know. Again, that's my information. If you have any questions, I'll be around. I probably went over time, so sorry. Thanks.
No, it's not too bad. We started a little late and took questions throughout, so it's fine.
Okay. Questions? I know I got questions in while I was speaking. Questions? And if you guys have any practices that you think we should use, please let me know. Like I said, we're researchers, so we could take the hit, right? We don't have to be profitable. So let me know, what you guys been using. If it works, I could try and look at it. Or if you had any ideas of stuff you think that would work, just let me know. Thanks.